Good evening, and welcome back to another journey through the quieter corridors of history. Tonight, we're stepping behind the heavy wooden doors of medieval convents into a world that was far more complex and human than the simple narratives of pious devotion might suggest. Before you settle in completely, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here together. And I'd love to know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. It's always fascinating to discover who's joining us in these late hours, scattered across the world, but somehow gathered here in this shared moment of curiosity about the past. Now, dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and let your mind drift back nearly 7 centuries to a time when the line between the sacred and the profane was perhaps thinner than we might imagine. The medieval convent was meant to be a sanctuary from the world's temptations, a place where women could dedicate their lives entirely to God, free from the complications of earthly desire. Yet these were not ethereal beings floating above human nature. They were women, with all the complexity that entails. Behind those thick stone walls, beneath the rhythmic chanting of daily prayers, there existed a rich inner world of longing, creativity, rebellion, and yes, sometimes passion. Tonight, we'll explore how desire in all its forms found its way into these supposedly cloistered lives. We'll discover love letters written by candlelight, mystical visions that blurred the lines between spiritual ecstasy and earthly pleasure, and the very human stories of women who refused to be contained by the narrow definitions of their time. Let us begin with the most intimate of perspectives, through the eyes and heart of one particular nun, writing by flickering candlelight in the depths of a French winter night. Verse 1. A 14th century nun's secret poetry. The year is 1347. Outside, the winds of early winter sweep across the countryside of northern France, carrying with them whispers of plague and political upheaval. But inside the convent of Sainte Marie des Prés, the thick stone walls create their own world, insulated from the chaos beyond. It is past Compline now, that final prayer service that marks the end of the canonical day. The other sisters have retreated to their cells, their soft footsteps fading down the long corridors like the last notes of evening song. You remain in your small chamber, no larger than a modest closet, with its single narrow window that during daylight hours offers a view of the herb garden, and, beyond it, the rolling hills that seem to stretch toward eternity. The candle on your wooden writing desk flickers, casting dancing shadows against the whitewashed walls. It's a luxury. This candle wax is precious, and you've saved your small weekly allowance for weeks to afford these private hours of light. The other sisters would be scandalized if they knew how you spend these stolen moments after the final prayers have been offered. Your fingers, stained permanently with ink, despite countless scrubbings, hover over a piece of precious parchment. It's rough beneath your touch, made from sheepskin by the monastery down the valley, and it carries that faint, earthy scent that always reminds you of the world beyond these walls. The quill in your hand, a gift from your father, before you took vows 5 years ago, feels familiar and forbidden all at once. You begin to write, not the careful Latin of your daily devotions, not the prescribed prayers that structure every waking hour, but words in the vulgar French that flows from your heart with dangerous ease. Mon cœur s'envole comme l'oiseau. My heart flies like a bird. The words seem to write themselves, spilling across the parchment like wine from an overturned cup. You write of spring mornings in your childhood garden, of the way sunlight looked different before you understood it was meant to remind you only of God's glory. You write of dreams that visit you in the deep hours of night dreams that you dare not confess to Mother Superior, dreams that blur the boundaries between divine love and something altogether more earthly. The scratching of your quill is the only sound in the profound silence of the convent night. Even the wind outside seems to have stilled, as if the world itself is holding its breath while you commit these dangerous thoughts to parchment. Dangerous because they speak of longing that extends beyond the spiritual realm, you've sworn to inhabit exclusively. You write of Sister Marguerite, 2 cells down from yours, whose voice during morning prayers carries a sweetness that makes your chest tighten in ways that surely cannot be entirely holy. You write of the visiting priest who comes monthly to hear confessions, whose eyes linger perhaps a moment too long when you speak of your struggles with worldly thoughts. You write of the merchant who delivers supplies to the convent, whose weathered hands tell stories of a life lived fully in the world you've renounced. But mostly, you write of the ache, that constant, unnamed yearning that sits beneath your ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. It's an ache that the prescribed prayers don't touch, that the daily rituals of devotion seem only to emphasize rather than soothe. In your secret poems, you give this ache words, shape, form. You make it beautiful rather than shameful. The hours pass like water through your fingers. Your candle burns lower, the wax pooling on the rough wooden surface of your desk. Your hand cramps from gripping the quill, but you cannot stop. These words feel like the truest prayers you've ever offered, not the Latin, phrases you've memorized and repeated countless times, but these raw, honest expressions of what it means to be human within these sacred walls. You write of the garden in summer, how the roses seem to mock your vows of chastity with their shameless blooming. You write of the way water looks in the washing basin at dawn, how it catches light like scattered diamonds, and how sometimes you stare at your own reflection with a mixture of recognition and surprise, as if you'd forgotten that beneath your habit lives a woman's body. There are nights when you burn what you've written before dawn arrives, feeding the parchment to your candle flame and watching your words dissolve into smoke and ash. The destruction feels necessary, a kind of confession in itself, an acknowledgement of the dangerous territory your thoughts have wandered into. But tonight feels different. Tonight, the words seem too precious to destroy, too honest to reduce to nothing. You write of the way music affects you during evening prayers, how certain combinations of notes seem to bypass your mind entirely and speak directly to some deeper part of yourself. You describe how sometimes, during the singing of the Te Deum or the Veni Creator Spiritus, you feel something rise within you that might be divine rapture, or might be something else, entirely something that makes your skin flush and your breathing shallow and your heart race in ways that surely have nothing to do with spiritual elevation. The bell tower clock strikes the 2nd hour past midnight. In just a few hours, the bell will ring for matins, and you'll join your sisters in the chapel for the first prayers of the new day. You'll kneel in your assigned place, 3rd row from the front, directly behind Sister Agnes, who always sways slightly during the longer prayers. You'll recite the familiar words, your voice blending with the others in the ancient rhythms of devotion. But for now, in this stolen time between one prayer and the next, you allow yourself to be fully human. You write of homesickness for a home you chose to leave, of curiosity about the lives you'll never live, of love that has nowhere to go but onto parchment in the form of carefully crafted verses. Your poems are not grand or elaborate. They don't aspire to the sophisticated theological imagery of the great mystics or the courtly refinement of the troubadours. They are simple, honest things like wildflowers growing in the cracks of cathedral stones. They speak of small moments, the way candlelight looks through tears, the sound of your own heartbeat during silent prayer, the texture of wool against skin during the long, cold months of winter. As you write, you're aware of the profound contradiction of your existence. By day, you are Sister Marie Claire, devoted bride of Christ, committed to a life of prayer, service, and spiritual contemplation. Your days are structured around the canonical hours, your thoughts supposedly focused entirely on the divine, your body transformed into a vessel for holy purpose. But here, in the deep privacy of night, with only candlelight and parchment as witnesses, you are something else entirely. You are a woman grappling with the full complexity of human experience, trying to find a way to be both sacred and real, both devoted and honest. You write until your eyes burn, and your hand shakes from fatigue. The candle has burned down to a stub, and you know that dawn is not far away. Carefully, you clean your quill and cap your precious bottle of ink. The parchment, covered now with your secret verses, you fold carefully and slip beneath the loose stone in the corner of your cell, the hiding place you discovered in your first year here, when homesickness felt like a physical illness and you needed somewhere to keep the single letter your family had been permitted to send. As you finally blow out the candle and settle onto your narrow straw mattress, you wonder about the other women sleeping in cells along this corridor. Do they too have secrets written on hidden parchments? Do they too struggle with the impossible task of containing the fullness of human experience within the boundaries of religious life? The darkness is complete now, and in it, you allow yourself one final, dangerous thought. Perhaps the love you write about in your poems, this aching, indefinable longing, is not the enemy of divine love, but simply another face of it. Perhaps the God who created human hearts, capable of such complex yearning, would not be entirely displeased with these midnight offerings of honesty. But that's a thought too dangerous, even for your secret poems. As sleep finally takes you, you whisper the familiar prayers of contrition, asking forgiveness for your wandering thoughts, your undisciplined desires, your refusal to be the perfect vessel of divine love that your vows promised you would become. And tomorrow, you know, you'll do it all again. Verse 2. The affair of Sister Benedetta Carlini. Visions, power, and punishment. We move now from the intimate shadows of personal longing to a story that shocked the Catholic Church and continues to fascinate historians today. Our setting shifts to early 17th century Italy, to the small mountain town of Pescia, where the convent of the Mother of God housed a community of Theatine nuns. The morning light filters through the tall windows of the convent chapel, casting long rectangles of golden illumination across the worn stone floor. It is here, in this space dedicated to divine worship, that Sister Benedetta Carlini first experienced what she claimed were mystical visions encounters with Christ himself that would eventually lead to scandal, investigation, and a trial that would expose the hidden complexities of convent life. Benedetta was not like the other nuns. From childhood, she had displayed what the Church might generously call spiritual gifts, or what skeptics might term an unusually vivid imagination, coupled with an extraordinary ability to convince others of her divine calling. Born into a prosperous family in 1590, she had entered the convent at age 9, a common practice for families seeking to secure their daughters' futures while demonstrating their own religious devotion. But where other girls might have settled into the quiet routine of convent life, Benedetta claimed to experience regular visitations from heavenly beings. She spoke of conversations with the Virgin Mary, of Christ appearing to her in dreams, of angels who guided her through mystical experiences that left her trembling and transported. The other nuns watched with a mixture of awe and unease as their young sister seemed to inhabit a spiritual realm that remained frustratingly inaccessible to them. By 1619, Benedetta had been elected abbess of her convent, an unusual honor for someone so young, but her reputation for holiness and her apparent direct line to divine wisdom made her seem the natural choice. It was around this time that a new novice arrived at the convent, a young woman named Bartolomea Crivelli, whose presence would fundamentally alter the trajectory of Benedetta's story. Bartolomea was assigned to serve as Benedetta's personal companion, a common arrangement that allowed experienced nuns to guide newcomers in their spiritual development. The two women shared living quarters, prayed together, and spent long hours in what appeared to be spiritual discourse. To the casual observer, there seemed a perfect example of holy mentorship, the older nun guiding the younger in the mysteries of religious life. But behind the carefully maintained facade of spiritual partnership, something far more complex was unfolding. During her later testimony to church investigators, Bartolomea would describe how their relationship had gradually transformed from spiritual guidance into something that bore little resemblance to the chaste devotion expected of religious women. She spoke of nights when Benedetta would claim to be possessed by the spirit of a male angel named Splenditello, during which her entire demeanor would change. Gone was the gentle, pious abbess. In her place emerged someone bold, commanding, and intensely physical. It was during these supposed possessions, Bartolomea testified, that Benedetta would engage in acts that violated every principle of their religious vows. The relationship continued for years, hidden beneath the routine of daily prayers and religious observances. Benedetta's mystical experiences became more frequent and more dramatic. She claimed to receive stigmata, the wounds of Christ, appearing on her body, and reported extended conversations with divine beings who revealed to her profound theological truths. The other nuns watched in fascination as their abbess seemed to exist simultaneously in their earthly community and in some elevated spiritual realm. Meanwhile, the church hierarchy was growing increasingly suspicious. Mystical experiences, particularly those claimed by women, were always viewed with caution by ecclesiastical authorities. While genuine mysticism was acknowledged as possible, the church was acutely aware that such claims could mask everything from mental illness to deliberate deception to heretical beliefs that threatened orthodox doctrine. In 1622, a formal investigation was launched. Church officials arrived at the convent of the Mother of God, armed with detailed questions, canonical authority, and a deep skepticism about Benedetta's claimed visions. They interviewed the nuns individually, examined Benedetta's supposed stigmata with the clinical detachment of men who had seen their share of religious fraud, and began to construct a picture of convent life that differed dramatically from the public image of holy devotion. The investigation revealed a community in which the normal boundaries of religious life had become strangely fluid. Benedetta's claimed divine visions had given her extraordinary authority within the convent, allowing her to bypass traditional religious hierarchies and create her own sphere of influence. Her relationship with Bartolomea, initially presented as spiritual mentorship, was exposed as something far more intimate and, in the eyes of the church, far more dangerous. Bartolomea's testimony was devastating in its detail. She described how Benedetta, claiming to be possessed by the angel Splenditello, would speak in a different voice, adopt masculine mannerisms, and engage in physical intimacy that violated the fundamental principles of religious chastity. She spoke of being told that these acts were spiritually sanctioned, that what appeared to be carnal desire was actually a higher form of divine love that transcended earthly understanding. The investigators faced a complex theological puzzle. If Benedetta's visions were genuine, then questioning them risked challenging authentic divine revelation. But if they were fabricated, then she was guilty not only of deception, but of using false mystical claims to justify behavior that violated her religious vows in the most fundamental way. The trial that followed would drag on for months, with testimonies that revealed the intricate ways in which spiritual authority, personal desire, and institutional power could become entangled within religious communities. Other nuns testified about the strange atmosphere that had developed in the convent under Benedetta's leadership, where the line between the sacred and the sensual had become increasingly blurred. Some spoke of feeling confused by Benedetta's teachings, which seemed to suggest that traditional understanding of sin and virtue might be incomplete. Others described a growing sense of unease as they watched their abbess claim ever more dramatic divine revelations while simultaneously flouting the basic principles of religious life. A few admitted to their own struggles with the conflicting messages they were receiving about the nature of holy love and earthly desire. The investigation also revealed the economic and social pressures that shaped convent life. These communities were not isolated islands of pure spirituality, but complex institutions embedded in the broader social fabric of their time. Families used convents to manage inheritance issues, to provide respectable futures for daughters they could not otherwise support, and to demonstrate their own religious devotion to the broader community. Within this context, someone like Benedetta, charismatic, visionary, and unbound by conventional interpretations of religious authority, could wield considerable influence. Her claimed divine visions gave her a form of power that bypassed traditional hierarchies, allowing her to create her own sphere of influence within the rigid structures of religious life. As the investigation progressed, a picture emerged of a woman who may have begun with genuine mystical experiences, but who had gradually learned to use claims of divine revelation to justify increasingly transgressive behavior. Whether she was a deliberate deceiver, a woman genuinely confused about the nature of her spiritual experiences, or something more complex, someone who existed in the liminal space between the sacred and the profane, remained an open question. The church authorities ultimately concluded that Benedetta's visions were false, her stigmata artificially produced, and her relationship with Bartolomea a serious violation of religious vows. She was stripped of her position as abbess, sentenced to lifelong imprisonment within the convent, and forbidden from any contact with the other nuns except during communal prayers. Bartolomea, considered more victim than perpetrator, was transferred to another convent where she could begin her religious life anew, away from the complicated spiritual dynamics that had shaped her early years in religious life. The convent of the Mother of God was placed under closer ecclesiastical supervision, its independence curtailed and its internal affairs subject to regular scrutiny. But the questions raised by Benedetta's case continued to resonate long after the trial concluded. Her story illuminated the complex ways in which women in religious communities navigated between official doctrine and personal experience, between institutional authority and individual spiritual insight, between the demands of chastity and the reality of human desire. In the centuries that followed, Benedetta Carlini's case would be largely forgotten, buried in church archives alongside countless other investigations into religious irregularities. It would not be until the late 20th century that historians would rediscover her story and recognize it as a remarkable window into the hidden complexities of medieval and early modern religious life. Her case reminds us that even within the most regulated and hierarchical institutions, human nature finds ways to assert itself. The women who entered convents brought with them the full range of human emotions, desires, and needs, and these could not be entirely suppressed by vows of chastity, obedience, and poverty. Instead, they found expression in complex forms that challenged simple categories of sacred and profane, holy and sinful, acceptable and transgressive. As we move deeper into our exploration of desire within religious communities, Benedetta's story serves as a reminder that the human heart, whether seeking divine love or earthly connection, rarely conforms to the neat boundaries established by institutional authority. Verse 3, the letters of Héloïse and Abélard, sacred love or spiritual scandal. We turn now from the stone corridors of Italian convents to the intellectual ferment of 12th century Paris, where one of history's most famous love affairs would blur the boundaries between earthly passion and divine devotion in ways that continue to captivate readers nearly 9 centuries later. The morning mist rises from the Seine, wrapping the emerging spires of Notre Dame in gauze-like veils as the city slowly awakens to another day. In a modest scriptorium attached to the convent of the Paraclete in Champagne, a woman sits before a writing desk, her hand moving steadily across parchment in the careful script that has become her signature. She pauses occasionally, not from uncertainty about her words, but from the weight of memory that each sentence carries. Her name is Héloïse, and she is writing what will become one of the most extraordinary pieces of correspondence in medieval literature, a letter to Père Abélard, the man who was once her teacher, her lover, her husband, and now, through the strange circularities of fate, her spiritual superior is the abbot who oversees her convent. The story begins nearly 2 decades earlier, when Héloïse was barely 17 and already renowned throughout Paris for her exceptional learning. In an age when most women were denied access to formal education, she had somehow acquired a knowledge of Latin, Greek, and Hebrew that rivaled that of the most accomplished scholars. Her uncle Fulbert, a canon of Notre Dame, had recognized her intellectual gifts and arranged for her to receive the finest education available. It was Fulbert who invited Père Abélard to serve as Héloïse's private tutor. Abélard was then at the height of his fame as a philosopher and theologian, a man whose brilliance in dialectical reasoning had made him the most sought-after teacher in Paris. Students flocked to hear his lectures on theology and logic, and his debates with other masters drew crowds who treated intellectual discourse like entertainment. But Abélard, for all his scholarly achievements, was also a man in his late 30s who had lived a life of careful celibacy in service to his intellectual pursuits. When he met Héloïse, brilliant, beautiful, and possessed of a mind that could match his own in philosophical discourse, something fundamental shifted in his understanding of what life might offer. The tutorials began innocently enough. Each morning, Héloïse would arrive at Abélard's chambers near the cathedral school, carrying her writing materials and prepared to engage with whatever text he had selected for their study. They would sit across from each other at a simple wooden table, books spread between them, their voices rising and falling in the rhythms of Socratic dialogue. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the nature of their meetings began to change. Abélard would later write that he found himself preparing for their sessions with an attention to his appearance that had nothing to do with scholarly dignity. Héloïse, for her part, discovered that the philosophical questions that captivated her during their discussions would linger in her mind long after she returned home, not because of their intellectual complexity, but because of the intensity with which Abélard's eyes had met hers as they debated the nature of universal truth. The transformation from teacher and student to lovers happened gradually, hidden beneath layers of intellectual discourse and scholarly propriety. Their letters from this period, if any existed, have not survived, but Abélard's later autobiographical account suggests a relationship that was as much about the meeting of minds as the attraction of bodies. When Héloïse became pregnant, the scandal threatened to destroy both their careers and their reputations. Medieval Paris, for all its intellectual sophistication, remained a deeply conservative society where such transgression could result in public disgrace and professional ruin. Abélard proposed marriage, but Héloïse, with a wisdom that seems remarkable for someone barely 18, argued against it. Her reasoning, preserved in her later letters, reveals a mind grappling with the fundamental contradictions between personal desire and social expectation. Marriage, she argued, would diminish Abélard's standing as a philosopher and cleric. It would reduce her from an intellectual equal to a conventional wife, subject to the ordinary domestic expectations that would inevitably interfere with the life of the mind they both valued. Instead, she proposed that they continue their relationship in secret, that their son be raised away from Paris, and that they maintain the fiction of teacher and student, while privately acknowledging themselves as lovers, bound by something deeper than legal contract. It was a remarkably modern solution to their dilemma, one that prioritized intellectual and emotional connection over social convention. But Abélard, perhaps swayed by conventional notions of honor and responsibility, insisted on marriage. The ceremony took place in secret, with only a few witnesses, and immediately afterward, both parties agreed to deny that it had occurred. This strange compromise satisfied no one and protected nothing. When rumors of the marriage began to circulate anyway, Héloïse publicly denied it, as they had agreed. But her uncle Fulbert, feeling that his family's honor had been compromised by the entire affair, arranged for a group of men to break into Abélard's chambers one night and castrate him, a brutal act of revenge that ended not only Abélard's sexual life, but also his career as a secular teacher. Faced with this devastating turn of events, both Abélard and Héloïse entered religious life. He became a monk at the Abbey of St. Denis, while she took vows at the convent of Argenteuil. It seemed, to their contemporaries, a fitting end to a story of intellectual pride and sexual transgression. two brilliant minds brought low by their inability to control earthly desire. But the story was far from over. Years later, when Abélard wrote his autobiographical Historia Calamitatum, the story of his misfortunes, and sent a copy to Héloïse, she responded with a series of letters that transformed their personal tragedy into one of literature's most profound meditations on the nature of love, both human and divine. Her first letter is a masterpiece of controlled passion, written by someone who has spent years learning to channel her emotions through the disciplined language of religious devotion. She begins with the formal salutations appropriate for correspondence between religious superiors, but quickly moves into territory that challenges every assumption about the nature of spiritual love. "You know, beloved," she writes, "and everyone knows how much I have lost in you, how at one wretched stroke of fortune, that supreme act of flagrant treachery robbed me of my very self in robbing me of you." The language is that of religious devotion, but the emotion is unmistakably that of a woman addressing her lost lover. She continues with words that must have shocked Abélard in their honesty. "I can find no penitence whereby to appease God, whom I always accuse of the greatest cruelty in regard to this outrage. By rebelling against his ordinance, I offend him more by my indignation than I pleased him by our former life." Here is the heart of Héloïse's theological scandal. She refuses to repent of their love affair. Even within the convent, even after taking vows of chastity and obedience, even after years of religious life, she maintains that what they shared was not sin, but the highest form of human connection. She argues that their love was so pure, so based on genuine affection, rather than mere physical desire, that it partook of the divine, rather than contradicting it. Her letters reveal a woman grappling with questions that go to the heart of medieval Christian theology. If God is love, as Scripture teaches, then how can human love, even passionate, physical love, be inherently sinful? If the divine spark exists within human beings, then might not the most profound human connections be reflections of divine love rather than rebellions against it? These are dangerous questions, ones that challenge the fundamental assumptions of monastic life. The entire structure of medieval Christianity rested on the assumption that earthly desires must be subordinated to spiritual ones, that the body must be disciplined in service to the soul, that human love, however profound, was ultimately a distraction from the only love that truly mattered. But Héloïse refuses to accept this hierarchy. In letter after letter, she argues that her love for Abélard was not opposed to her love of God, but was perhaps the clearest manifestation of divine love she had ever experienced. She describes how their intellectual conversations had lifted her toward truth, how their physical intimacy had revealed dimensions of existence she had never imagined, how their entire relationship had been a form of worship that no amount of conventional prayer could replace. Abélard's responses, while loving, attempt to redirect her toward more orthodox expressions of devotion. He acknowledges the power of what they shared, but argues that their separation has allowed both of them to discover forms of love that are more perfect because they are more purely spiritual. He encourages her to find in her relationship with Christ the fulfillment that she once sought in their human connection. But Héloïse will not be consoled by such conventional spirituality. Her final letters become increasingly theological in their sophistication, drawing on her extensive knowledge of Scripture and philosophy to construct an argument for the essential holiness of their love. She quotes Augustine, Jerome, and other church fathers, but interprets their teachings in ways that support her conviction that what she and Abélard shared was not sin but sacrament. The correspondence eventually ends, not because either party was convinced by the other's arguments, but perhaps because the questions they were exploring were too dangerous to pursue further. Héloïse lived for nearly 40 more years as abbess of the Paraclete, earning a reputation for wisdom, administrative skill, and theological learning that made her one of the most respected religious figures of her time. But the letters remain, preserved by scribes who recognized their extraordinary nature and copied by readers who found in them a vision of love that transcended the conventional boundaries between sacred and profane. They became part of the medieval literary tradition, influencing everything from courtly romance to mystical theology. What makes the correspondence so remarkable is not simply its emotional intensity, but its intellectual sophistication. Héloïse was not simply a woman mourning a lost love. She was a trained philosopher, constructing a systematic argument about the nature of divine and human love. Her letters represent one of the most sustained challenges to conventional religious thought produced by any medieval writer, male or female. The questions she raised about the relationship between physical and spiritual love, about the nature of sin and repentance, about the possibility that human passion might be a manifestation rather than a contradiction of divine love, would continue to resonate throughout medieval culture and beyond. As we sit with Héloïse in her scriptorium, watching her hand move across the parchment, we witness something extraordinary. A brilliant mind refusing to accept easy answers about the most fundamental questions of human existence. Her letters stand as testament to the possibility that even within the most restrictive religious systems, the human heart and mind can find ways to assert their own understanding of truth. Verse 4. A Bishop's Burden, the Journal of Guillaume de Montfort. Our final segment shifts perspective entirely, taking us into the private chambers of ecclesiastical authority, where we discover the personal records of a man tasked with maintaining order in a world that seemed increasingly resistant to control. The episcopal palace of Beauvais sits like a fortress against the evening sky, its towers catching the last light of day as candles begin to flicker in windows throughout the city below. In the bishop's private study, a man in his middle years sits hunched over a leather-bound journal, his pen moving slowly across the page as he records his thoughts at the end of another difficult day. Bishop Guillaume de Montfort has served the Church faithfully for nearly 20 years, rising through the ranks of ecclesiastical hierarchy through a combination of theological learning, administrative skill, and what his colleagues might charitably call an unwavering commitment to moral discipline. But tonight, as he writes by the light of expensive beeswax candles, his words reveal a man increasingly troubled by the complexities of his calling. Anno Domini 1329, the Feast of St. Margaret, he begins, his Latin precise, but tinged with weariness. Today I received another report from the convent of St. Agnes. The third this month. Mother Superior writes that the younger sisters continue to resist the stricter observancy, mandated following last year's irregularities. He pauses, setting down his pen to rub his temples. The irregularities he refers to so delicately were anything but subtle a scandal involving Sister Margot and the convent's chaplain that had required months of careful handling to prevent from becoming public knowledge. The chaplain had been quietly transferred to a remote parish. Sister Margot had been confined to the convent for extended penance, and Guillaume had imposed new restrictions on contact between the nuns and male clergy. But managing the aftermath of scandal, he has learned, is far more complex than simply issuing new regulations. The human heart, it seems, possesses an almost supernatural ability to find ways around even the most carefully constructed barriers. I fear, he continues writing, that my efforts to protect these women from temptation may have had the opposite effect. The more strictly I attempt to regulate their lives, the more creative they become in circumventing my authority. Sister Agnes was discovered yesterday with what appeared to be a love poem written in the margins of her breviary. When questioned, she claimed it was a mystical meditation on the love between Christ and the Church. How does one respond to such theological innovation? This question gets to the heart of Guillaume's dilemma. As a bishop, he is responsible for maintaining orthodox religious practice within his diocese. But as a scholar who has spent years studying theology, he understands that the line between acceptable mystical experience and dangerous spiritual innovation is often impossibly thin. When nuns claim that their passionate poetry is actually religious devotion, when they insist that their intense friendships are models of Christian love, when they argue that their resistance to conventional authority is itself a form of spiritual obedience. How is he to judge? His journal entries reveal a man caught between his institutional responsibilities and his growing awareness of the human complexities that no amount of canonical law seems able to address. He writes of visiting convents where the nuns appear to follow every rule while somehow managing to create an atmosphere that feels distinctly unchaste. He describes conversations with abbesses who speak in perfectly orthodox language while their eyes suggest they are discussing something else entirely. The convent of Notre Dame des Prés presents particular challenges. He notes in an entry dated several weeks later, Mother Superior Isabel maintains that the unusual closeness between certain sisters represents nothing more than the spiritual friendship recommended by St. Augustine. Yet the report from Sister Catherine suggests relationships that extend well beyond the boundaries of appropriate religious affection. Guillaume has learned to read between the lines of such reports. Sister Catherine, he knows, is motivated as much by personal jealousy as by religious concern. She has been excluded from the inner circle of friends whose behavior she now criticizes. But that doesn't necessarily make her observations incorrect. The challenge is separating legitimate spiritual friendship from relationships that have crossed into territory that threatens the fundamental principles of religious life. The bishop's frustration is evident in passages where he attempts to understand how women who have voluntarily taken vows of chastity can seem so resistant to actually living chastely. He has consulted theological texts, corresponded with other bishops facing similar challenges, and even attempted to develop new approaches to spiritual formation that might address what he sees as a systematic problem. Perhaps, he writes in a particularly revealing entry, the fault lies not with these women, but with our expectations of them. We ask young girls, some barely past childhood, to renounce forever desires they have barely begun to understand. We place them in communities where they live in intimate proximity with others, facing the same impossible demands. And then we express surprise when human nature asserts itself. This moment of insight represents a remarkable departure from conventional ecclesiastical thinking. Most of Guillaume's contemporaries would have attributed sexual irregularities in convents to moral weakness, demonic temptation, or insufficient spiritual discipline. But his years of dealing with such problems have led him to a more complex understanding of the forces at work. He writes extensively about his attempts to reform the convents under his jurisdiction, describing initiatives that range from the practical to the desperate. He has separated nuns he suspects of inappropriate relationships, assigned older sisters to supervise younger ones, instituted new rules about private meetings and personal correspondence, and even experimented with architectural modifications designed to eliminate spaces where clandestine encounters might occur. But each solution seems to create new problems. Separated friends find ways to communicate through elaborate systems of coded messages. Supervised nuns develop relationships with their supervisors. New rules are met with creative interpretations that technically comply with the letter of the law while violating its spirit. The architectural modifications simply force relationships underground, making them harder to detect and potentially more dangerous. Today I spoke with Father Benedict about the confessions he hears from the Sisters of Sainte Marie, Guillaume records. He tells me that many of them confess to sins that seem designed more to provoke than to seek absolution. They describe temptations in such detail that he suspects they are reliving rather than repenting their experiences. Yet, what can he do? The seal of confession prevents him from sharing specifics, and to refuse absolution would create scandal. The bishop's journal reveals the elaborate cat-and-mouse game that has developed between ecclesiastical authority and the women it seeks to regulate. The nuns have learned to speak in language that appears orthodox while conveying meanings that are anything but conventional. They have mastered the art of appearing compliant while maintaining inner lives that remain stubbornly resistant to institutional control. Guillaume describes visiting convents where the surface atmosphere is one of perfect religious devotion nuns kneeling at appropriate times, reciting prayers with apparent fervor, engaging in theological discussions that demonstrate impressive learning. Yet something in the air suggests that beneath this performance lies a reality that would shock the families who have entrusted their daughters to religious life. Sister Marie Claire approached me after today's chapter meeting, he writes. She spoke eloquently about her desire to deepen her spiritual life, to move beyond mere observance toward genuine mystical experience. Her words were theologically sophisticated, her demeanor appropriately humble. Yet I could not shake the feeling that she was speaking in code, that her references to mystical union and spiritual ecstasy referred to experiences that had little to do with divine love. The bishop's suspicions are not unfounded. He has learned to recognize the signs of convents where the official religious life has become a kind of theater performed for the benefit of ecclesiastical visitors, while the real life of the community happens in spaces and times that remain carefully hidden from official scrutiny. As his journal entries accumulate, Guillaume's tone becomes increasingly philosophical. He begins to question not just the effectiveness of his methods, but the entire system of assumptions on which his authority rests. If human nature is as resistant to regulation as his experience suggests, if the women under his spiritual care are as creative in circumventing his authority as they appear to be, then perhaps the problem lies not with their moral failures, but with the impossibility of the standards he is trying to enforce. I find myself wondering, he writes in one of his most introspective passages, whether the God who created human beings with such capacity for love, in all its forms, truly intends for that capacity to be entirely suppressed in service to institutional order. The nuns I attempt to regulate are not monsters of depravity, but women grappling with the fundamental tension between their human nature and the demands of religious life. Perhaps their struggles are not signs of moral failure, but evidence of their essential humanity. This recognition leads Guillaume to a gradual shift in his approach. Rather than attempting to eliminate all opportunities for inappropriate relationships, he begins experimenting with ways to channel the emotional and spiritual energy of the vows, communities under his care, in directions that might be both authentic and orthodox. He encourages the development of religious poetry that allows for the expression of passionate devotion without crossing into explicitly sexual territory. He permits certain forms of spiritual friendship while maintaining careful boundaries around physical expression. He works with abbesses to create systems of spiritual direction that acknowledge the reality of human emotion while directing it toward appropriately religious ends. The results are mixed, but Guillaume's journal suggests a growing sense that this approach, however imperfect, is more effective than his earlier attempts at strict suppression. The women under his care seem more genuinely engaged with religious life when their humanity is acknowledged rather than denied, when their capacity for love is redirected rather than simply forbidden. Perhaps, he concludes in one of his final entries, the goal should not be to create perfect religious communities, but to create communities where imperfect human beings can gradually grow toward greater holiness. The women I serve will never be the ethereal beings that our idealizations of religious life sometimes suggest, but they may become something more valuable. Authentic human beings whose struggles with love, desire, and devotion bring them closer to understanding the complexities of divine love itself. As we close Guillaume's journal and leave him to his prayers in the gathering darkness of his study, we see reflected in his struggles the same human complexities that have marked every story we've encountered tonight. Whether expressed through secret poetry, mystical visions, passionate correspondence, or careful administration, the fundamental challenge remains the same: how to honor both the demands of institutional religious life and the irreducible complexity of human nature. Conclusion: as the candles burn low in monasteries and convents across medieval Europe, as the bells ring out the final prayers of another day, we find ourselves at the end of our journey to the hidden chambers of religious life. We have walked beside a young nun writing love poems by candlelight, witnessed the scandal of Sister Benedetta's claimed divine visions, marveled at Héloïse's theological brilliance, and shared Bishop Guillaume's struggle to maintain order in a world that resisted easy categorization. What emerges from these stories is not a simple tale of corruption within religious institutions, nor a romantic celebration of forbidden love, but something far more complex and ultimately more human. The medieval convent was indeed meant to be a place apart from the world, a sanctuary where women could devote themselves entirely to divine love. But it was also, inevitably, a place where human beings lived together in intimate community, bringing with them all the emotional complexity, creative energy, and stubborn humanity that no amount of institutional regulation could entirely contain. The women whose stories we've shared tonight were not rebels against religion, but pioneers in understanding that the spiritual life is large enough to encompass the full range of human experience. Their letters, poems, visions, and relationships suggest that the boundaries between sacred and profane love may be more porous than traditional theology would suggest, that the capacity for passionate devotion, whether directed toward God, toward another person, or toward the life of the mind, might be manifestations of the same fundamental human capacity for transcendence. In our modern world, where the institutional authority of medieval Christianity has largely dissolved, we might find in these stories not scandal but wisdom. The struggles of these medieval women to honor both their spiritual commitments and their human complexity speak to contemporary questions about the relationship between institutional belonging and personal authenticity, between community standards and individual truth. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you'll carry with you the image of that young nun, still writing by candlelight in her cell, still seeking words that can hold both her devotion to God and her irreducible humanity. Her candle has long since burned out. Her parchments have crumbled to dust, but the questions she grappled with about love, desire, authenticity, and transcendence remain as vital today as they were 7 centuries ago. Rest well, and may your dreams be filled with the quiet courage of those who refuse to accept that being fully human and being gentle